As you know, I'm working on a city exploration game that takes place in a huge procedural city where every building can be entered. I rarely talk about the 3D art that I used to build my city, because I am primarily a programmer and I've always felt like the procedural generation algorithm that puts the 3D models together was the most interesting thing about my project. But now I think it's time to touch upon the other side of my city generation, which is the actual geometry. Also, another thing that prompted me to make this video is that I had some people in the comments make assumptions that the buildings in my city are pre-made, or even that the whole project is an asset flip. So I hope this video will clarify what is a pre-made asset and what isn't, for those who care about these things. Okay, first I would like to explain what I mean by procedural when I talk about my procedural city. Because nowadays, a lot of the manual level design tools involve some automation, so technically every game's environment is procedural to some degree, as nobody places every single blade of grass or scattered piece of garbage manually. Well, my city isn't just made with procedural tools, it is fully procedural, meaning every single item is placed by an algorithm. This is what my editor looks like when the game is not running. As you can see, there's nothing there. No pre-made areas, no pre-placed props. So if I want to move something, I have to find that item's offset in the code and adjust it there. Doesn't mean that I can't add manually designed areas to my city though, and I still might do that for special gameplay locations. Now, onto the geometry. Most of the base geometry of my city is embarrassingly simple. I started the project by just stacking cubes of various sizes and proportions. The walls of the buildings are just tall cubes, the floors are flattened cubes, and the windows are just the gaps between them. At least that's how it was at first. I am still building upon that base, but now I have multiple shapes for the walls, so they aren't all flat. The windows have additional geometry that frames them, both on the inside and on the outside. And there are lots of additional elements that are designed to hide this uniformity somewhat. I am also using hardware instancing over mesh generation in most situations, which means that whenever I need to generate an object of a certain shape, rather than generating custom geometry vertex by vertex, I take a simple building block, such as a cube or a plane, and duplicate it with various transforms to fit the shape that I need. This approach only works well for a city environment that naturally has a lot of straight lines, flat surfaces, and rectangular shapes, and it allows me to draw a lot of objects on the screen without tanking the performance. And Unreal Engine has great built-in functionality to facilitate it, with hierarchical instance static meshes and per instance custom data. Speaking of which, I often rely on the custom data to create the illusion of variety on what is essentially the same duplicated mesh. For example, this is how I draw the buildings far in the distance. Their colors, window sizes, window lights are all different, but in fact they are all just the same cube that is duplicated using hardware instancing. That's how I'm able to render thousands of buildings in each frame. I do the same thing with almost all geometry in my city. I am instancing every object that repeats or has a chance of repeating. Similar to the buildings, the ground, the roads, the pavements, the water are also all instance shapes. This is why it would be hard for me to add elevation to the city, although I would very much like to, as having a lot of flat plains is just so convenient. But I guess I could replace parts of the ground with voxel-based terrain instead, and I will probably do that at some point to create hills. And of course, because I am relying so much on instancing and instance transforms, almost all such objects use custom materials with world-aligned UVs. A quick explanation for those who aren't familiar with 3D modeling. UV maps are basically sets of coordinates stored in a model that dictate how a flat texture will be displayed on that model. Where U is the horizontal coordinate of the flat texture and V is the vertical one. World-aligned means I am simply calculating these coordinates from the 3D space of my game rather than the model itself. It is convenient because I don't have to worry about creating the UV maps for each model, and I can be sure that such material will look the same on any geometry I apply it to. But of course it can be a problem for objects of complex shapes, which is yet another reason to stick to simple geometry. I'm also using a lot of procedural materials that I've made, which create a variety of surface types, but only use a small set of basic textures such as noise, dirt or other imperfections, or gradients of different shapes. They are very convenient because they create a lot of variety by making use of Unreal Engine's built-in shader functions, but don't take up a whole lot of resources. For example, almost all pavements in the city have the same material with randomized parameters. It can create different tile patterns with different seam width, tile and seam color, even various amounts of damage, although I am keeping the damage at 0 for now, as it will be part of the gameplay later. But, of course, there are some modular objects that require more complex geometry. For example, bridges, Skytram tracks and stations, rooftops, and a few more. These were modeled either by me in Blender or by my collaborator Don, who is a skilled 3D artist unlike me, as you can see. I'll leave a link to his portfolio in the description. There also are a few more generated objects, like for example these billboards, as well as the shelves and cabinets in the city. That's why each one of them is unique. And lastly, there are things that don't need to be modular. For those, I do use a lot of pre-made assets, such as furniture, plants, street props, although I do modify most of them and use custom materials to suit my city's needs. Oh, and I should mention that the Skytram stations and the trams themselves were also made by Don. Now, if you've been following me, you must have noticed the mouse hover cars that are everywhere in my city. This model is also from the marketplace, made by a designer called Alexei. I bought it to act as a placeholder until I implement a modular vehicle generator, similar to the spaceships in No Man's Sky. But it fits so well that I think I'll just keep it. So that about covers the basics of my procedural city's geometry. There's a lot more detail there that I haven't covered, of course, but I hope this gives some idea of what Vontra City is actually made of, and how it all comes together. And as usual, I have to make a disclaimer that this is a project that is still in development, so all of what I said might change. Stay creative!